The footage you see on screen right now was taken by a dive camera during a body recovery mission. The diver is at a depth of around 30 metres and is inside an upside-down tugboat which had sunk 3 days prior. Directed by someone on the surface, the diver and his team moved from room to room. The flipped corridors and poor visibility made progress slow, but they had managed to locate and recover 4 of the 12 crew members. Since it had been 3 days since the boat had sunk, this was purely a body recovery mission, so you can understand the diver's shock when this happens.
On the ceiling, yeah? Okay. What's that? Okay. Alright, you found one, yeah? He's alive! Okay, keep him there.
A hand, reaching out from the murky water, assumed to belong to a perished crew member. But then, that same hand grips the divers and refuses to let go. Something that only a living person would be able to do. Incredibly, against all odds, someone had survived in the sunken vessel for almost 3 days. But how? And how do you rescue someone that has been 30 metres underwater for 3 days without causing potentially deadly side effects? Well, let's find out. This is the harrowing ordeal of Harrison Okene. Harrison Okene was a 29-year-old man from Warri, Nigeria. He found work by filling the position of cook on a tugboat called the Jascom 4. A tugboat, as the name suggests, is a boat used to pull or even push other marine vessels. This is done when a boat is unable to safely navigate a waterway on its own, or even to move vessels that have no movement capabilities at all. Cargo barges, for example. Harrison quickly got into a routine aboard the Jascom 4. He would get up an hour or two before his crewmates to make sure that breakfast was ready by the time they awoke. Life at sea is hard. The constant movement, the cold, damp conditions, even just the inability to leave your place of work. Imagine that one co-worker you have that you can just about stand to be around at work. Maybe they talk too much, or they have an annoying laugh. Or maybe you just don't get along. And now imagine having to live with that person as well as work with them. And if that wasn't enough, the ocean is a dangerous place. One good wave can sweep a man overboard. Storms can destroy even the largest of ships, and if you happen to get lost without the right equipment, well, good luck. With all of that hanging over your head, I guess a good warm meal would do wonders for morale. On the 26th of May 2013, Harrison was aboard the Jascom 4 as it, along with 2 other tugboats, stabilised an oil tanker as it filled up just 12 miles off the coast of Nigeria. It was around 5 AM, and knowing that he would have to start preparing breakfast soon, Harrison rolled out of his bunk and headed to the bathroom. He yawned and then rubbed his face in an attempt to wake himself up. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean was anything but calm, and the water swirled violently, slamming into the sides of the boat. Used to the sway and shift that came with rough water, Harrison wasn't worried, and he entered the small bathroom stall, still yawning, though the cold floor did wake him up a little. Then he felt the boat lurch around him, his stomach dropping as if he were going over the drop of a roller coaster. Immediately, he knew that this was not just your usual rough seas. Now he was definitely awake, his entire body buzzing with adrenaline, his brain working overtime to figure out what had happened and what to do now. He could feel the boat tilting and realised with horror that it was sinking. He pushed the metal door open and, not caring that he was only wearing his underwear, ran out into the dark corridor, thinking only about getting to the escape hatch. As the hatch came into view, he saw that 3 of his co-workers were already there. Before he reached them, though, he watched in horror as water rushed in and swept all 3 of the men out of the boat and into the churning ocean. Something he knew that they could not survive. With very few options now available to him, Harrison froze for just a second as the deadly water surged towards him. the boat groaning as it shifted and rolled. He then turned, intending to run, but before he could, the water swept him into a nearby cabin and into another bathroom. Plunged into darkness, Harrison could do nothing but pray as cold water quickly filled the room. It rose up, past his knees, past his stomach, up to his chest as he pleaded for someone to help him. The boat crashed into the ocean floor, and Harrison was sure that his end was quickly approaching. He used the underside of the sink to try and get away from the water, the room now upside down, but this was an obviously futile attempt, as there was nowhere for him to go. No way to escape the rising water. He closed his eyes, prayed, and waited for the inevitable. But after what seemed like both an eternity and an instant, Harrison realised that the water did not seem to be getting any higher. He opened his eyes in an attempt to look around, but it made no difference as it was pitch black in the bathroom. For a while, he just floated there, listening to the boat creak around him, his breath loud in the small space, wondering if each movement would cause his air pocket to fill. Water lapped against the walls, and occasionally, objects that had been thrown around during the chaos would bump into things, or even Harrison himself, no doubt startling him every time. I can't imagine being surrounded by nothing but darkness, knowing that you are at the bottom of the ocean, with a limited amount of air, alone. After some time, Harrison realised that he needed to get out of the cold water if at all possible. He reached above his head and, while he could reach the ceiling, which was actually the floor, there was just enough room for him to get out of the water if he could find something to float on. With that plan in mind, he began mustering up the courage to move from his relatively safe spot to search for supplies. He worried that moving would upset whatever balance had caused the air pocket, but he also knew that he couldn't stay in this water for much longer. Eventually, with his heart hammering in his chest, he began the slow process of moving into the adjoining cabin. He used his hands to feel for the doorframe, and then, after another quick prayer, he took a big breath of air and ducked under the water, passing into the room. Still using his hands to feel along the wall, not wanting to stray too far and not be able to find his way back through the darkness, Harrison began pulling off the wall panelling and grabbing anything not screwed down. He moved back and forth between the cabin and the toilet, creating a pile of wood and plastic in the corner of his air pocket, until he finally managed to create a sort of shelf for himself. He carefully manoeuvred himself onto the makeshift structure, his body aching and shivering from the cold. He sipped from a bottle of Coke he had found floating in the water, and had to force himself to not drink the whole bottle in one go. But he was so thirsty. Being surrounded by water that you are not able to drink, when all you can think about is how thirsty you are, is a truly awful predicament to be in. But Harrison's mouth and skin had been shredded by the salt water just from sitting in it, so he knew better than to succumb to drinking even a sip of the ocean water. Instead, he stared out into the darkness, clutching the bottle of Coke, not even sure if his eyes were open or closed anymore, listening to the sounds around him. He heard fish swimming through the water, the swishing of them turning quickly and the bubbles produced as they moved around. He wondered if any of his crewmates had managed to escape, or if they too had been trapped, but had not been as lucky as he had. He couldn't help but wonder if the fish had been attracted to the boat by the bodies of his crewmates, and the noises in the water conjured up images in his mind that he tried not to think about. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and his thirst was so bad that it was all he could focus on. As he lay, huddled on his makeshift raft, a new noise caught his attention. A deep, clunking noise, in a rhythm, totally different from the noises of things bumping into each other. Someone was hammering on the outside of the boat. Realising this, Harrison scrambled to find something that he could use to send a signal back. He grabbed something, which turned out to be a water filter, and used it to hammer on the walls of the room. Then he listened, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. Then, for the first time in almost 60 hours, Harrison saw light. He blinked, staring at the light, probably not sure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He watched as the light grew stronger, and then a diver swam straight past the door of the cabin, not seeing Harrison through the murky water. Harrison watched as the light faded again, panic sneaking in as he watched the diver leave, but that diver was not alone, and when he saw another light approaching the door to the cabin, he decided that he was not going to let them leave without him again. He dived into the cold water and swam towards the diver as they arrived at the doorframe, reaching out and tapping them to let him know that he was there. He felt the diver jump at his touch and quickly began waving his hand to let the diver know that he was there and that he was alive. I cannot imagine how Harrison would have been feeling in that moment, and how much that diver holding his hand meant to him. He then led the diver back up to his air bubble, and you can see how shocked Harrison is. He didn't think he would make it out of that room. The diver is being instructed to keep Harrison calm by a coordinator on the surface. This is incredibly important, as in this moment, Harrison is actually in more danger than he had been hours earlier. See, when we breathe in environments where the pressure around us differs from that of normal air, gases begin to build up in the tissues of our bodies. For example, when we are deep underwater, our bodies absorb more nitrogen. If we then swim straight up to the surface, that nitrogen will likely begin to bubble. Depending on where these bubbles form, they can cause many issues, from headaches and joint pain to seizures and even death. Typically, divers will spend less than an hour at these depths to reduce the risk of complications. Harrison had spent almost 3 days at the depth of 30 meters, and so was at huge risk of developing deadly decompression sickness if his ascent was not properly controlled. If he began to panic, it would have been very difficult for the diver to give him directions and explain what needed to happen. Harrison could have tried to swim off once they cleared the boat, panic driving him to get to the surface as quickly as possible. Thankfully, the dive team were able to put together a plan quickly and began the process of rescuing Harrison. They handed him a dive helmet, along with breathing apparatus, telling him that he had to keep it on no matter what, and then guided him to a diving bell that had been lowered down. A diving bell is a chamber used to lower and lift divers in and out of the water. The type used in Harrison's case was a closed bell, which allows pressure to be maintained as it is lifted to the surface. This was critical in Harrison's case, as they needed to bring him to the surface quickly to assess his condition, and he had been in the water for so long that decompressing underwater was not possible. Harrison, exhausted from his ordeal from the past couple of days, passed out during the transfer to the diving bell, but his rescuers were able to safely secure him, and he was finally on his way up to the surface. Once there, he was transferred to a decompression chamber and checked over for injuries. He was obviously dehydrated and hungry. His skin, having been submerged in the ocean water for such a long time, was peeling and sore. But otherwise, he was in surprisingly good health. He was devastated to learn that he was the only member of the Jaskin 4's 12-man crew to survive. He had been sure that at least some of them would have been able to escape. He was also surprised to learn that he had been trapped for almost 60 hours, as he had thought it had only been around 12. The lack of visual stimuli could have caused this shift in Harrison's perception of time. Being surrounded by nothing but blackness, he had nothing to use as an indication of time passing. He could have hallucinated his way through at least some of his time down there, brought on by the complete darkness and his brain filling in the empty space. He may have mistaken those hallucinations for dreams and simply lost track of time. It is also possible that his mind did this as a protective measure. Being trapped, alone, in the dark for extended periods of time can be incredibly traumatic for a person, and our brains can be very good at shielding us from traumatic memories. Whatever the cause, I'm glad that his perspective shifted to the shorter side, rather than his ordeal feeling like it dragged on for weeks. Harrison spent a further 60 hours in the decompression chamber, which slowly and safely reduced the nitrogen levels in his body, until, finally, he was able to step on solid ground again. Having thought that he would never see the sun again, I can't imagine how overwhelming that moment would have been for him. Harrison returned home, vowing to never enter the ocean again, and was plagued by nightmares for years after the accident, frequently waking his wife up, telling her that their bed was sinking and jumping up to get away from the imaginary water. Despite his vow, however, just 2 years after his harrowing ordeal, Harrison returned to the sea, this time as a certified commercial diver. The diver that had found Harrison was the one to present him with his certificate. Harrison believes that God was looking down on him that day. Others say that it was just pure luck that the air pocket was big enough to sustain him until rescuers arrived. But what do you think? I'd love to know your thoughts on this story. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and leave any suggestions for future videos down in the comment section below. Thanks for joining me for this story, and keep yourself safe out there.